2024 has been and continues to be a big election year around the world. Here in Central Europe, the Czechs are next in line to queue at the ballot box. In fact, they've already done so. This time it's the local regional elections that took place on Saturday and Sunday. Despite the recent flooding, many Czechs are expected to turn out. Will we see any big changes that could result in or impact national politics? Well, to find out, I'm now joined by Ján Michalčák, a political scientist and international security expert. Thank you very much for joining us on World News tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, we just saw the friendly matchup of women's football here in Warsaw. It looks like Prague came out ahead. But concerning the elections that are taking place in your country, what do you think what is the most that's at stake during these local elections?
Right. As you rightly said, those are regional elections that just taken place, and a third of the Senate has been voted in. There's a second round in 2 weeks in some of the regions. Of course, as regional elections, those are only second or third in the level of importance, I would say. Obviously, we're all waiting for the general election about to take place in 2025. That's actually also one of the biggest points as it pertains to the regional election, because if anything, I would say that those serve as a kind of check of temperature for the upcoming general election, and we're probably going to talk about the results in a little bit. You know, the important thing to watch is how the government parties do and how the opposition does, because that could be a kind of a tell for the future and what might happen to an extent at the state level in a year's time.
For sure. So what were the main issues in these elections? I imagine they vary from region to region, but for the most part, what were the main issues?
I think, generally speaking, about local elections anywhere in Europe and probably even the world, you cannot avoid state-level problems being debated in the regional campaigns. Although the regional senates have little to no say in the state affairs, they are still debated because, simply put, those are the issues that people understand and people can relate to. So one of the biggest issues has obviously been the rise in prices, because, to remind your viewers, Czechia has been one of the countries with the highest levels of inflation in Europe. Last year we saw an inflation about 20%. So prices in all around the country, and especially bigger cities, have risen significantly, whereas the wages have not kept pace. That obviously troubles the voters. So they see their vote, or part of them, of course, sees their vote as a possibility to voice criticism toward the government. So that, and obviously, generally speaking, a possible rise in the living standards in the region is definitely an issue. Although, again, the regional parliaments have little say only in those matters, and obviously state politics is what matters most.
And concerning turnout, would you say, I mean, we just had these disastrous floods in part of the country, and still people had to turn out to give their votes. Do we know anything about turnout and how that fared this time around?
Turnout has been pretty much average in the affected regions that saw the biggest floodings. Obviously, the turnout was lower than usual. So we're talking about 50%, below 50% in some of the regions. And obviously, for those faced with the flooding, elections are not really top of their minds right now. There was talk about possibly postponing the election, but because the process of doing so would have been very complicated, the government decided not to go ahead, because to manage that, they would have had to act on Tuesday already. So there was a little time to do that. So they decided to go ahead anyway.
Yeah, difficult situation there. So the populist ANO party, or ANO, of former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, has won these regional elections for the third time in a row. Runoff, as you mentioned, for the Senate are scheduled for next week. But, you know, if we look at his party and whether this was a success, do you think Andrej Babiš would say that this is a success for his party?
Definitely. It was a massive success for ANO. They won in all regions except 2. where local politicians have been traditionally strong. But other than that, in the rest of the country, ANO has dominated. And in one of the regions, the total vote share of ANO only was close to 50%, which rarely happens in Czechia. We have a proportionate system, obviously. So if a single party can manage to score 50% in a free and fair election, that's a big deal. So yeah, Babiš definitely has a reason to celebrate, because as we said, it is a crucible for the election next year, definitely.
Right. Also trending across Europe are far-right parties. In Czech, you had the SPD, the Trikolora movement, and Svobodní. They teamed up in some constituencies. How did they fare? And what was their platforms, more or less, that they were running on?
I would have to go back to what I said previously about many of those parties actually not differentiating much between the general election and the regional election in terms of the issues that they raise. And some parties, especially those you mentioned, so SPD, Trikolora, we have the new star of the political scene, motorists, they intentionally campaign on state-level issues, so be it being anti-migration generally, without explaining much what that means and how would they act. They still repeat the same topics to which the voters can relate. And yes, in some regions, especially the border regions, those parties were somewhat successful. But for example, for the motorists, they expected a much larger vote share. So they themselves, the leader of the party, said that he's not really happy with the result of
Well, I think we can potentially that's a good thing. So you've mentioned that the national making this a national referendum, more or less, on the five-party coalition. Do you think this was a good strategy for these opposition parties, and did it pan out for them?
I think partly yes, especially for ANO, leader of the opposition. As I said, a great success, whereas for the government, for some parties more than others, it was a total flop. Let's mention the Pirate Party, which is part of the coalition, and it basically got zero mandates in the regional elections. So a complete disaster for them as the main liberal party, or they would like to portray themselves as such. So again, the government, the opposition has definitely many reasons to celebrate. For example, that liberal parties of the coalition getting weaker. Those results will mean that they will be embroiled in turmoil and chaos. There will be discussions about how to take those parties forward. For example, the Pirate Party leadership offered their seats, and there will be a new vote for the leadership of the party. And obviously, a clever opposition will want to use that opportunity to strengthen themselves even more ahead of the upcoming election in 2025.
I'd like to ask about the rhetoric surrounding this campaign, because we've seen some billboards out there that showed a migrant with a bloody knife and somehow linking this to healthcare, that we don't need migrants, and obviously a populistic stance there. Is this affected the political discourse in the Czech Republic and what people are talking about during the elections?
Yes, one thing to point out at the start is that Czechia has seen very little to no migration whatsoever from, from the Middle East or Africa, which was portrayed on the poster that you mentioned. Yes, we have had significant numbers of refugees from Ukraine who Russia illegally attacked. That's of course, and we have been having great successes with integrating those migrants into our society for many reasons. But those the other group of migrants that SPD has referred to on their poster, we've seen very little of those, and still they play the immigration cards, because successive surveys in Czechia have shown that migration, and especially illegal migration, is the #1 issue that people are most afraid of, which is paradoxical if you take into account that we have zero of illegal migration in Czechia. If anything, Czechia is obviously a transit country further to the west, but very little migrants of our own. But still, and even more paradoxical is that the poster that you referred to was a massive poster at the main square in Prague, Wenceslav Square. It was placed in Prague, where no regional elections take place at all. And still, the SPD played that card, and the police could do very little because obviously freedom of speech conflicts with our freedom not to be faced with false and alarming information. So yeah.
Yeah, it seems like just stirring the pot. I'm glad you mentioned the Ukrainian population in Czechia, because it's actually quite significant.
Yes.
In fact, as a proportion of the population, it's even more significant than the amount of Ukrainian refugees that we've taken in here in Poland. Yeah. So did that play any role in any of these elections?
Unfortunately, all of the opposition parties, I would say, are starting to play a somewhat, I wouldn't say anti-Ukrainian, but more cautious note in the campaign. We've seen many false news, much disinformation about how much the Ukrainian refugees are reportedly costing the Czech state, which I would say is a big error on the part of the governing coalition, because again, data has shown that we have been actually benefiting from Ukrainian refugees, not only in Czechia, but also in Czechia. And I would say that the governing coalition did very little to communicate that information clearly to the audience. I'm not saying that they would have convinced everyone, obviously not, because some people are so deep into the disinformation scene that there's basically nothing you can do to convince them otherwise. But for some voters who are on the verge of voting either for the coalition or someone for the opposition, it could have done a lot. And I'm really sad to say that it was the media that actually had to explain the level of benefits and give people the data, the figures that show that we've been earning money from Ukrainian refugees.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's been a boon for the economy here in Poland as well. I think we have a very similar experience. Last question, I'd just like to ask about your thoughts on the elections in Germany. I mean, for the first time since World War II, we're seeing a far-right nationalist party rise up, if you will, in these local elections. And of course, we have the elections coming up here in Brandenburg. As a Czech, what is your reaction to seeing this?
As a Czech and as a political scientist, seeing a significant rise of the far-right populist party is definitely unsettling. And especially in Germany, given the country's importance and the country's size, it's enormously unsettling. And I don't know what the future has to bring, but the AfD is definitely a force to be reckoned with. It either has won or is a close second in all the states that have seen a local election recently in Germany. And let's see, next year is the federal election. And obviously, given the policies that the AfD advocates, be it a strict ban on migration, they talk about potentially even closing the borders. We've seen consistent border checks on the German borders now, even under the current government, which would presumably get even stricter, which is obviously bad for be it the Schengen area as such, as a concept, be it trade inside of the EU, and it would endanger the EU's values as such. Because as a response to the border checks that the Germans introduced, we've seen populist parties in other countries, the Netherlands, France, calling for similar measures as well. So if the AfD wins or becomes a significant force, much more significant than it is today, which is very likely, I think we're going to see the EU as such and its values endangered. So we'll see. But
well, hopefully no domino effect there. Ján Michalčák, political scientist, international security expert, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on these important elections. Appreciate it.
It was a pleasure to be here.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time. Good night.